All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I think we're going to try to get started. We have our whole panel here, and we may have some people filtering in the audience, but welcome. And thank you for joining the branded and influencer marketing discussion today here at Digital Hollywood. I'm Andrew Sampson. I'm Managing Director of Possible, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this awesome group next to me. To set the stage just a little bit to get our conversation going, as an industry, we've really seen incredible change in how we communicate with our consumers over the last few years. And one thing that's amazing about this business is it never stops changing. Most days I love that about this work. Some days I wish it would stop just for a minute, but it doesn't. And so we always have to figure out how to keep up. And certainly these kind of events really help us with that kind of thing. So with the millennial audience now really kind of squarely in the target market for most marketers, we're many years into asking this question that we hear all the time, which is, what do millennials want? And that's kind of a terrible question for us to ask, because millennials don't all think as one. They don't all think together. We really need to be thin slicing this group to figure out how they're going to be spoken to in much smaller groups that really reflect their interests. A better question to ask is your message authentic? Because whatever a subgroup of millennial brands hopes to be spoken to about, you can assume that they have a very highly sophisticated marketing BS detector. And if they find something that is a brand message that is inauthentic, what are they going to do? Number one, they're not going to buy your product. And the research shows that 78% of millennials who have a brand experience that they find to be inauthentic, it will drive them to a competitor, sometimes permanently. So they won't buy your product, and they'll use every channel available to tell the world how stupid and out of touch you are. And that does not feel good when you're a brand. So we want to try to figure out how to keep from doing that, and not to help brands not pretend that they are something they're not. So my own perspective coming into this panel is creating digital entertainment experiences over the last 20 years. As a startup entrepreneur building an agency here in LA called Schematic, selling that to WPP and merging it with a bunch of other agencies to form Possible. We talk about creating the experiences that help brands keep their promises to customers. And we're at the forefront using our own data on over 250 million Americans and the data that we collect from our clients to inspire digital experiences that create what sounds like a contradiction in terms, which is personalization at scale. So, so often success in brand marketing means leveraging an influencer to help a brand show consumers what they stand for. But today we really want to try to move past defining an influencer as having Logan Paul talk about your product during a YouTube video. That's a thing you can do, but we're getting a little more sophisticated than that. So our panel is full of real-world stories of success and occasionally of failure that we hope are going to help guide our audience in their efforts. The common thread in the broad variety of work we'll talk about, it's all around making connections and starting a conversation. We have two panelists in Jennifer and Melissa who are focused on the social good space, helping brands succeed through partnerships. Matt and Cameron are really looking across a broad set of properties to create sophisticated interoperating marketing ecosystems that they'll be talking about. And like me, Paul represents the agency perspective, his being an agency where the entire premise is built on the power of emotion and ensuring that all their work is emotionally based. And of course, all of us realize the power of data in targeting these experiences, and we'll each be discussing data and its role before, during, and after a consumer has a digital experience. So let me start with Matt at the end, and would love to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into questions.
My name is Matt Lawler, and I am live streaming.
You're not texting?
No, I swear I'm not texting. We're just gonna put this right there because
This session also
Facebook
is
should
live
see that.
streamed, so now we have
multi-camera
angles.
You need multiple POVs on the story, right? So I am Director of Digital Partnerships at AEG. We are the largest sports and entertainment company in the world. We operate over 130 venues sports venues around the world. We have a heavy footprint in music, and we own multiple sports teams. And my job spans a lot of those products, specifically domestically, but we can get into that later.
I'm Jennifer Palais, and I just started my own consultancy, Palais Consulting, after many years of working in agencies and also content development companies as well.
Awesome. I'm Melissa Anderson. I'm co-founder and president of Public Good, and we are America's AI for Good platform. What that means is that we make the news actionable. So whether you're reading a story about domestic violence, suicide, a natural disaster, or shooting, we give readers actions they can take to make a difference in their local community. You can see us on CNN, on USA Today, ABC, NBC, across most of major media. So our goal is to make content actionable so people can make the world a better place.
My name's Cam Partridge. I work at a company called Brandon Entertainment Network. We're the pioneers in the space from integration standpoint. So we actually do product placement on film, OTT, and streaming. And then the influencer side, we've been doing it for about 10 years. Our company is started by a gentleman named Ricky Ray Butler, who's now our CEO of Brandon Entertainment Network. So we focus on integrations, and we represent the brands in the space.
Hi, I'm Paul Spriggs, and I head up the System One agency in the Americas. System One has about 15 years expertise in behavioural science on the research side, eliciting emotion and then being able to translate that into a score that accurately predicts profitable growth. The business has moved into the agency side in developing creative. And what we do is, I guess our main point is that we only produce emotional creative because we know categorically that it builds profitable growth over the longer term. And number two, we don't produce anything unless it achieves a certain level of effectiveness. So we guarantee our creative work for all of our clients.
All right, very interesting proposition, which we'll dig into later. Melissa, let me start with you. We talk so much when we think about influencer and brand marketing about reputation. Part of your role is to help the reputation of your media clients. How do you do that? How do you measurably improve trust in media outlets?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we work both with media and with brands, but I think the answer translates across both of them. And in terms of building trust, I think a lot of it is that what we've seen is that when people take action about something they care about alongside the brand, that's an incredible way to kind of build trust for that brand. So if there's no kind of stronger emotion than what you really care about and what you want to change. So as an example, on CNN, we power all of their disaster relief impact programs. And so after the hurricane, we actually did a study to look at how did the NPS score change after people had taken action on helping people in the hurricane. And we saw that we had the users who had taken action under CNN's brand had a 92 NPS score.
Can you explain Net Promoter Score for people just so that they know?
Sure. So Net Promoter Score is essentially how you feel about that brand. So questions like, would you recommend that brand? And typically media is somewhere around neutral, and some media is below 0. So to have a Net Promoter Score of 92 is very unusual. If you think about like a brand like United Airlines would be a negative 30. If you think of a brand like a Patagonia, they'd be more like a 60. So to give you a sense, those are kind of the scales. So a 90 is sort of off the charts, but there's a huge emotional payoff. And again, if you're doing something about what you care about and you're under the halo of that brand, you're building trust. And one of the things that we have written about, and we actually have a white paper here with a bunch of data that I'm happy to hand out called Do Well by Doing Good. But part of what we're looking at is the data behind, when you talk about trust around a brand, when something bad happens to a brand, like United and their staff are pulling people off the plane, or we saw the recent example with Starbucks and they're hitting hard times after the Philadelphia incident. But how does that affect the brand? And what we're seeing is when we look at brands that have done a lot of social impact programs, then their stock is more resilient. People give them the benefit of the doubt. If you haven't built that asset of doing good as part of your daily business, whether that's news or brands, then when something bad happens, you don't get the benefit of the doubt. And we've seen that in lots of examples, like United, like in Uber. And so, I think that it's not only, you know, the kind of social impact and trust, it's really about engaging people around stuff they care about over the long term, so you have long-term trust. So when something kind of negative happens, you don't lose all trust after, you know, a single or a few incidents.
It's interesting when you think about that concept of black eyes on brands and stock price, right?
Yeah.
Facebook, which obviously took a very, very large hit, and you know, I think most would argue has made some bad moves. Their stock has now completely erased any of the deficits that they had around that. They are back to above where they had been before. So apparently, we trust them enough, and they have enough of a halo around them.
I'm going to challenge that a little bit by saying I think there's one exception to the building brand as an asset. I mean, I think that Facebook also is one of a kind. I mean, Instagram's kind of like Facebook, but it's really not. And so I think...
And owned by Facebook.
What's that?
And owned by Facebook.
Yeah, true. And so if you only have, you know, me personally, all of my father's family's on Facebook. So, you know, I got mad for a while and I went off them, but it's kind of hard that I'm not in contact with my dad's family. And so, you know, because it's a social network, because it's so big, because it's got so many people on it, even if you haven't forgiven them, because they're the only game in town, you kind of end up getting some back because of that reason. Versus trust, but
sounds like we should be launching a competitive social network later.
That's hard.
Matt, let me ask you about that. Obviously, AEG has a huge number of properties and platforms. Two things. One, how do you manage reputation across all of those? And how do you how do you collect data across those to kind of make them more than the sum of their parts?
Sure. So Melissa talked about it a little bit. Melissa, right?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, just want to get it right. The company's broken up, there's a lot of companies on the portfolio, so it's broken up into music, facilities, sports, and then there's a fourth group, partnerships, which is the group that I'm in, and we work primarily with our sponsors and partners and brand partners. And one of the things that happens is we may have a partnership within one of the verticals for music or sports or facilities, or it may go across. We are pretty close to securing 9 digits in revenue for this year and counting. And one of the things that works for us is being able to communicate back to partners what the value of their partnership with us is. So similar to Net Promoter Score, it's really critical for us to be gathering data, understanding at every point where we can what the value of partnership is. That then comes into play when we talk about the teams, their assets, the players, the mascots, the people tied to the teams that are influencing conversation, partner journalists, the media. It really does span a wide gamut, and everywhere we can, we're trying to collect as much information as we can to understand our impact, while also being really careful to take care of that data and not pass it along in any way that would jeopardize our audience, because ultimately we are an experience-based company and the fans are as important to us as our brand partners.
Yeah. So much of the influencer marketing is around creating a halo around your brand. You know, Melissa talked a little bit about the idea of, in her business, really the cause is the influencer, right? It's less of a person than more a cause that you get associated with a brand. Really, really interesting concept. Cam, for you guys, you are both on the influencer side and the product placement side. How do those two work together, and how do you use each to help the other?
Sure. I think the best example of this is, you know, we do product placements across all streaming platforms, films, etc. And so, you know, we have a dedicated team who works with the Producers Guild of America to secure integrations. So where it gets really exciting, and I think really the forefront and the future of integrations, is having a brand where you see your brand on a show on Netflix, and then you're seeing your favorite influencer talking about that brand, or you actually have some of the cast talking about that brand. So we've done this several times where, you know, for example, you know, we did a partnership with sending some of the bachelorettes to a resort. And so the contestants went there, we did the integration, but then we also, on the social side, contracted out these, you know, bachelorette contestants to talk about it from a social perspective. So for us, it's really exciting because you're getting this 360 effect where you can integrate into content. I think, you know, our shareholders, Bill Gates, he's seeing the future of advertising being within the content, and having brands empower content versus kind of the disruption model that's been with us.
But really, what does he know? I mean, show me a track record. So, Jennifer, you talked about that you had left marketing advertising and then you came back. Why did you come back?
That is a good question. No, I initially I left in the late '90s or so, as I felt like advertising at that time was a model where unless you had $350 million or whatever it was, you couldn't really get your message out. I was working at Deutsche at the time on, and then I worked at DirecTV, but the budgets were really huge and inflated, and I didn't feel any like I was doing anything in the world, like I was helping anyone. I did always look at it like, okay, we keep Mitsubishi going, there keeps jobs going, but it was really when social media came around and I got really involved. I had my own business at the time, and I was learning it for my business, and so I came right back around into marketing and advertising again, but just from this side of social, because it felt like a democratization of media, and anyone who had a brand or had a service and they wanted to get that message out, and if it was accepted, if people could choose, they could self-select, which I think is really important. We were talking about non-interruptive, which is what I'm really passionate about, and I have been since the 90s or whatever. It's just this idea that people could promote this media themselves. They didn't have to be forced to watch a commercial. And so I had friends that were actors, and they'd say, oh, I can't get, no one will watch, I can't get a meeting with an agent or this or that, but it's like, I was telling them, go on YouTube, and then a few years later, then there's all the huge YouTube stars and stuff. But it made sense to me at that point, and at that point too, there were influencers in a way that was just really natural. The way that it starts with small communities where you're like, hey, my product and your product, this makes sense. And so influencers, that idea before it was called that, was just like, hey, there's a synergy here with our service and product, Yeah.
So when we start thinking about some of the specific work that you guys have done in this area, Paul, can you tell us a little bit about the Purina Puppyhood work and how data informed your product?
Sure. So I think in what I'm going to be talking about, some is on the research side and some is what I'm doing on the creative side. In this particular example with the Purina, it's something that the research division researched, and I think it's like a 3-minute format, and it really went to the top of, we do a ranking every year, we live test the Super Bowl, we test, in the last year, we've tested 20,000 pieces of creative globally in the last year, so we're testing stuff all the time in every country. And Purina Puppyhood just did an amazing job. I think, it's really about pure entertainment. I think that's why there's such a good fit with influencer and branded entertainment, is that you're not necessarily thinking about the brand filter all the time. What you're doing is thinking about your audience, what they like, and what they respond to. So in a way, it's back to the good principles of entertaining an audience. And so when you entertain, you create emotion, you evoke emotion, and you have a better fit for the brand. And I think Purina did a good job of that.
Paul, when you were introducing yourself, you talked about that you guys guarantee your creative. Now, I think anybody who's ever been in the agency business, that's a scary concept. How does that work, and has it ever gotten you in trouble?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm living that claim. We have a very flamboyant CEO, global CEO in London, and he's very bold, and it's partly what attracted me to it, because when he first spoke to me about the opportunity on the agency side, I was like, are you serious? And really, obviously there's parameters around that, but essentially we have a quantitative black box way, the research division does, church and state, of testing the creative, okay? And we only work on emotional briefs, if you like, and we discuss why that works with clients. And yeah, it's difficult. I'll tell you why it's difficult. It's more around the stimulus, because what we do is we test the advertising idea or content idea, like the one I'm working on right now. We're in post-production. It's about 3 minutes. It scored a 5-star, which is less than 5% of all communication out there is a 5-star, right? We tested that because the stimulus was very, very close to what we thought we were going to actually produce. So it created an accurate sort of determination of the what the creative idea was going to be. I've then worked with other clients where we've had stimulus where we just can't quite get it. So, for example, performance-based humour. where it really relies on the sort of nuance and the timing of performance. And you try and do that in a sort of like an animatic or something like that, and the respondents get tripped up on that a little bit. And so that's where it gets pretty difficult, because in our approach, if we don't achieve a 3-star, we keep working at our cost, not the client's cost, in order to get it above that. So I've seen both, and it's very challenging. But you know what? The whole business premise is that essentially we are sick of the the ineffective side of marketing. We've all known that half of advertising or marketing doesn't work, and so our whole premise is really built on wanting to reduce waste. It's all about profitable growth and zero waste. So we try and walk the talk on that.
Well, we'll talk about some of those kind of, failures and things that maybe didn't have a lot of good ideas behind them. A couple more success stories. Matt, in some of our conversations, you've talked about the work that you guys have done on Stagecoach and how you used influencers to both promote and also really kind of legitimize it as an event.
Yeah, the festivals are some of our more popular product, right? Obviously, with music trending the way it is amongst all demographics and probably never going to stop. I think the festival space is a great place to be in, and Stagecoach, which is the weekend after the last weekend of Coachella, is really, it's a weekend after Coachella, right? Coachella comes first and Stagecoach next. But there's still a lot of interest in that, and we've found ways where we know people are authentically already going, right, or planning to go, and we know that they have a certain level of influence. So we work with them to say, look, we'd love for you to come on our dime, and we'll give you an experience, right? We'll, as Stagecoach, as AEG, we'll take you around, we'll give you some exclusive access, and all we want you to do is share your time, right? Just talk about how much fun you're having, post a little bit about the event. What we've learned from that is that that's also an opportunity for us where people are aligned with particular brands to say, look, we have this crew of 80 people that we've already contracted to do some promotion for us for the event. We would love to try and also align you with them, brand partner, because your guys' values are pretty much in line. So, that becomes a discussion, and then that ultimately becomes revenue for us in a way that's not destructive to those influencers' audience, because they're already going to the event. The brand partners, ideally, it's content that their fans would expect to see in their newsfeed or in their stories, and ultimately it's just added value for us.
And who are some of the influencers that were particularly valuable, and how do you pick them? Are you looking for large audiences? Are you looking for smaller niche audiences? What does the process look like?
Yeah, I think everyone on the panel will tell you that it depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? So some people talk about a sweet spot right on the curve of engagement where somebody with a huge audience of 10 million people has low engagement, right? 1%, 2%. Less than. Somebody with a following of 50K to 100K has higher engagement, 5%, 10%. And somewhere in the middle is where you want to go to try and maximize your reach and engagement. But I think ultimately what it boils down to is what's the objective, right? People changing opinions and actually getting people to go to the event, right? So we're trying to drive ticket sales as a bottom line objective in addition to partnership revenue. So identifying people that can get their fans to take action, right? And this, we're not perfect there, but understanding how those people drive click-through on a link, right? Or drive shares of particular content, opposed to just likes and comments and passive engagement. Breaking down your metrics and understanding what you're actually trying to achieve ends up driving more success.
Melissa and Cam, does the process that you guys have, is it different? Is it the same? How do you make your choices?
Choices on?
Who is the right influencer for a particular brand? And I know sometimes for you it's not individuals, it is a cause, but how do you choose what cause you think is right to associate with a brand that's looking to you for help?
Yeah, that's helpful. I think we're going to circle back to what you started with, is the value of authenticity. And so, people can smell non-authenticity a million miles away, and that's part of why we put together this white paper, Do Well by Doing Good, is that it really talks about what is it that makes a cause authentic, and how do you choose that? And one of the most authentic ways, and I was on a panel here last night, if any of you were at dinner, and we talked about like with Lyft. So what they do is they provide relief rides. So, having your core product be part of the cause you're working on, there's an authenticity there. So when people need to get somewhere, when there's been a natural disaster, they can provide a ride, which is very different than a company, sort of jumping on childhood cancer that has nothing to do with it, which it's a good cause and that's noble, but it doesn't really connect with what they're doing. And I think an even deeper level of authenticity is also around, when we look at the different ride-sharing platforms, again, around reducing carbon footprint. And so, that's kind of recognizing to say, listen, what we're doing is having a negative impact on the environment. We're going to take responsibility for that, and we're going to do something about it. And that's sort of a really authentic way to be honest about the effect of your product, and then turn the table so that then you have a positive glow around it. So I think that also another thing to note around cause is that today brands should be bolder. And so when we look back in time, brands were often afraid to take stances on strong issues. But today, the Edelmans of the world would tell you, you are better off standing strong on a stance and alienating a small part of your audience than you are being neutral, because you'll lose everybody. And there's some interesting data around this. 38% of people will abandon a brand for being silent. So really standing up for those tough causes, like gun control, like diversity, is really important.
Matt, I know you wanted to jump in.
So I love that. And the question I would ask you is, what if your brand is not bold? What if at your core you're not a strong, outspoken brand, or you have a CEO that says, I prefer to be silent like Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple pieces to that. I think in terms of the CEO, there's probably some sharing of data with the CEO to show, today with today's audiences, what brands are successful, and how are the silent brands doing against certain causes, and case studies showing that the brands that have been the most vocal are surpassing from a competitive standpoint the ones that aren't. So I think, data sharing with the CEO is probably helpful. It's true, brands played it safe in the past, and that used to work. I think it's really saying that the audience has changed, and today people are more activism oriented than they have been since the 60s. So doing what you did before isn't necessarily going to work in the future. So, but I think that in a big organization like yours, it's a huge paradigm shift that if it were to be done quickly, that would be inauthentic. So I think it's probably about really laying a roadmap. And one of the good ways for a big company like that to begin to pivot is to start internally. So engaging your employees around certain causes and things that you're doing, do that first so it becomes more of your DNA before you go out to your customers and say, look what we're doing. Right. Because it's really dangerous to go out, as McDonald's got in trouble this year for touting certain causes without walking the walk on the back end.
Right, and I was just going to say, that's the reason I asked the question. I think being bold can come from different places in the organization, Sure. And what is natural to an organization from a figurehead standpoint may not necessarily reflect the full body of the organization, right, and all the different components working within it. But the idea that you can still be bold or still have that voice and still have that influence.
True, and maybe it starts with the employee programs being bold, and the CEO 100%. Is silent for a long time. And we've seen strategies like that. Over 100%. To Jennifer.
Sorry.
I was just saying it's such a good point, because where's that bridge, and what I've seen work a lot of times when an agency or a CEO isn't willing to stand up in certain ways, and there's a lot of that goes on, is this idea of creating culture. And so you might not be ready to get behind these certain things that are happening. You don't want to alienate anyone, but you can say, what can we create? Like, what do we believe in? Even if it isn't something that's specifically cause related, mm-hmm. Instead of, it's a step forward from slapping a banner on a concert. It's that step forward of how can we partner with an artist, mm-hmm. To create interest, or how can we create a new, a new event or something where we are actually participating, you're not just sponsoring. So that's mm-hmm. A step forward of kind of venturing out and I'm going to create something, and then that boldness starts to come forward.
Yep. Just to piggyback off Jennifer's statement there, I think that's what we see the value in integrating with influencers is, finding those influencers who are most passionate about a organization or a cause. So then you get that authenticity. We're able to guarantee views on the data side the metric side, but finding those people who will third-party validate for you, because this new generation, millennials, Gen Z, they see these influencers and these creators as a trusted source. And partnering with them can take your brand to the next level. They trust these kids and these creators, but they might not trust a Bezos, for example, or a CEO. And so it's very important to do the integrations with the creators.
Or a brand. There's a lot of distrust among millennials and Z and X around brand.
Yep.
Well, all right, so we've touched on it, and it's starting to come up again. So let's take a few minutes and dive into data, because when we start thinking about how do we target, that's everything. 5+ years ago, we always used to hear from clients, we don't have enough data. We don't know enough about our consumers. Now we universally hear, we have too much data. We're drowning in data, and what we need is not so much more data, we need help telling us what that data should guide us to do. We need decision support systems. So all of you, of course, in everything that you do, data is such a critical piece. Talk a little bit about how you use the data, whether it be in the research before making an experience, whether it be during to personalize, and whether it be after to get learnings from it. It's a big topic, so let's dive in and let's see where it takes us.
I'll kick it off. So I think data is very important when you're choosing influencers or creators to work with. To find the right audience and who's going to match the audience that you're looking for. But I think too, a layer on that is there could be a creator, an influencer who has the perfect audience for you. But if they're not passionate, and for example, if they're a Nike lover and you're Adidas, that's not going to work out for you. So you have to find those creators who are going to talk about your brand and product in a way that's a natural fit, that their audience knows about. Because if they wear Nike all the time and then Adidas comes around and says, let's do a deal, certainly you're going to get a lot of comments for that. So I think I'm going back to passion levels, because I think it's very key for working with creators.
I've got another one as well, which is, first of all, a fundamental belief that things, I think, have become a little too data-driven. And so when you're in the creative development process, data should inform it, not drive creative development. And we're seeing globally a bit of a shift too far. I think it's coming back now, that things aren't just driven by data. And I think, in terms of the other aspect, in terms of how to use data, there's different kinds of creative and there's different kinds of ideas. And you can have a very short-term spike, which doesn't lead to long-term profitable growth. And I think we're also seeing that as well. You can spend an enormous amount of money that it gets you a bit of interest because you've latched onto an influencer that maybe doesn't have a natural synergy or with the brand. And you're not getting a build. And so I guess what we're about at System 1 is having options through the creative development process. So when you had the question earlier on about how do you identify the right influencer, we're always about, rather than just picking one, it's about minimizing risk. So you may have 3 and we test them. But obviously you've got what they bring to the party, but then you've got the creative idea itself and how it integrates and how it works. So we're able to test through the creative development process a way of eliminating but also optimizing through the process. And we essentially get stuff back, data back, that says, this is going to achieve a very, very good short-term spike, and or is going to achieve a longer-term objective. Now, going right back to what we were saying earlier on, I think authenticity should be table stakes. It's not necessarily table stakes, but I think it should be. I think the other thing is, what is the objective that you're trying to achieve? We all know that we should start off with objectives, but often we can start with an influencer and get excited, just like we do with any kind of creative idea. We start with a creative idea and get so excited. So I think when you've got the objective, the intended outcomes, you go through looking at options and then looking at what it's going to achieve in terms of short-term objectives or perhaps longer-term. That can help you use data in the right way to inform creativity.
Yeah. I think I agree. That's how I've usually used it. I'm a strategist, and a lot of times it's a creative strategy that I'm writing a creative brief, taking all of that data that we do have and trying to make a story, out of it that will make sense for the brand or the integration, but also make sense to the creatives. Like, what is the spark here? And a lot of it that I look at is, the audiences, the demographics. Like we were talking about, all these niche audiences out there, and we don't create one piece of content anymore at all, as we all know, but you can really craft for each individual platform. You have to craft for the platform, but then you also can craft for these smaller audiences. So you really need to get inside their heads and say, what is important to these people? And looking at it almost as like a service, like what can I give to these people? What are they looking for? What do they care about most in the world? And how can we deliver that with the content that we're creating? So the data, I usually use it to try and, the psychographics, try and get inside what people's interests and passions are, and about what would make them actionable, like what would make them want to be a participant, really. So I was always looking at things as participation based, which is now, I love the angle about action. It's that if someone can get involved in some way, then the attachment and the trust begins, and the relationship can more likely continue and not be kind of a flash in the pan. So I think that's where that data can really help you anchor your creative strategy, and make it a relationship with these fans and these audiences that is going to be long term.
Yep, I'm going to jump in here a little bit. I think for our agency and our standpoint, we don't have a creative director where we work, and we're careful to prescribe to creators what to do and say, because they have built their audience.
They're the creators.
What they know works best for their audience. So how we approach it is we work with the brand up front. Okay, what are your objectives? What are your KPIs? Sorry, that mic's in the way. What are the outcomes? But let's work on talking points, and then let's work with the influencer and creator let's hand it over. And I think that can be scary for brands sometimes, because brands are so used to saying, this is the message, this is where it is, this is how it's going to be. And you're relinquishing that now. But you need to trust the influencer that they know how to speak to their audience best. That will get you the outcome, because I've seen way too many scenarios where brands are, hey, can they cut their hair? Can they wear a purple shirt instead of a white shirt? And that's something you want to avoid from an integration standpoint.
There's a real tension, right, that we're hearing, which is this idea between minimizing risk and being concerned about your brand health, and then letting people be themselves, and what may from that.
You have to.
It can be a bit of a concern. So how do we manage it?
Yeah, I mean, you have to drive the objective, right? The number one goal, and it's been said by everybody, right, is, what is the objective of the partnership, of the relationship? Mm-hmm. And if you're doing that, if you have that as table stakes, right, as Paul says, then 9 times out of 10, everything else that follows fits in there, because you're thinking about what the end outcome is going to be. So an example, we have a spirits partner, and they activated, we're rich with festival examples, but at Coachella, and what they wanted to do was they wanted to generate content in real time. So it wasn't a situation where we could research all these people beforehand and send them to the event and then say, okay, then take pictures. We had to find people in the moment who were actively generating interest based on their conversation at the festival in the desert, to then invite them to a specific experience to engage with the partner and create on top of that. And so if you think about the ways in which the data can be used, or the way that which influence can be applied, I can influence you to have a better opinion of a poor customer service experience, right? I can influence you to take a picture. I can influence you to share a post, right? There are a number of different actions, but I think the thing is you mitigate risk if you are thinking about your objective up front and making sure that whoever you work with has the same objective.
I can tell you one thing that we do on this, and I guess it's a principle, which is in the past, it was a lot of creative directors or what have you that would determine and make the decision for the consumer in terms of, limiting risk. You'd be like, well, that's not going to work, this is going to work. And then something would end up perhaps getting researched. The way we work is we have as many options as possible. We can turn things around in like a 24-hour period. So what we would say in terms of that is just do it. You know what I mean? And so I'll give you an example.
That should be a slogan for some brand.
I know. Isn't it
Somebody
great?
grab that and run with it.
Write it down, yeah.
How much did you pay Nike, Paul?
Yeah. I know. So here's an example. In the content space, entertainment, you've got the freedom to go a little longer, right? You can do 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever you want to do. But longer is not necessarily better. And what we do with data is we know where in the communication you've lost an audience. And there's a thing in the behavioural science called the peak end rule. And that is you can run something for 3 minutes, for example, and in the last 40 seconds, you've really lost someone. And there's a disproportionate effect on the entire outtake of what it is, whether it's memorability or emotion or whatever it can be. So in example of that, you might have an influencer that just goes on and on and on, you know what I mean? Or the idea is just a little bit too embellished when it ends up on video. And you can look at different ways of perhaps seeing how that's working or not working. So I think, again, just do it and then test it, I guess, versus preempt it.
And the traditional ad model, I would say, too, just really educating your brand, you know, who you're working with. Because I just remember working on the Lady Gaga Grammys, the David Bowie tribute, and Intel, you know, they're like, here, tell Lady Gaga to say this, you know, and here's like this long list
Probably
of
not
tweets.
going to work.
And I'm like, nah, and it's exactly what you're talking about, Matt. I knew what we needed to hit. I knew what our objective was, and I'm like, yes, we'll say that, sure. You know, but it's like,
Sure.
There's no way. We worked with her people, and we just made sure that, you know, we covered what was covered, and trying to explain to the partner, you didn't hire like a monkey, you know, that's gonna just like do what you want it to do when you want it, which they think that a lot of times, you know.
It's true.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on the data insights piece. I think that our core value that we're providing, that Action provides, is insights into, you know, if you think about engagement level, sort of the deepest level of engagement beyond, you know, like or comment or share is standing up to do something. And so what we found with our media partners is that by analyzing the engagement of the action rate and how people are taking action on an article or content, it really informs then how much they will distribute that content, how long they'll keep that content up. We did a series around food security with the Gates Foundation, and it was really interesting. Originally they were going to do 12 pieces of content. They ended up doing over 50. I think they got addicted to the data because they, you know, causes they thought people would really stand behind and align behind. Some of them did, some they didn't, but they would see some articles that had very few eyeballs, if they touched on the right emotional chord, would have an incredibly high action rate. And so, you know, again, looking kind of bottom up rather than top down, rather than saying we're going to push this one really heavily, this gave them the insight to look at what content should continue to be distributed because people are really emotionally connecting with it, and which content people really aren't emotionally connecting with it.
And that's particularly high praise coming from an organization like the Gates Foundation that probably prizes data above all other organizations in the world. I mean, it's what they're famous
Yeah, we get
for.
brought in because we bring data to impact.
That's great.
The other piece I thought was interesting to touch on is with CNN and their hurricane work, is that we were able to look at, you know, as Hurricane Harvey came in, literally hour by hour what the giving rate was. And it was really fascinating. Actually, the CEO of CNN said, wow, we've been doing impact work for years and we've never known what the impact was because we weren't measuring, because when it goes through our platform, we can look at hour by hour. People generally donate to big natural disasters during lunch and before they go to bed. It's probably not surprising. But in terms of timing, you know, getting the opportunity for people to get involved closely to what's happened is the most important thing. And so we see it, you know, kind of goes up. Once it hits landfall, it spikes, and then it comes down. And the interesting thing is, from a journalistic perspective, there's much more content later on. So a week after the hurricane hit, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you know, we're seeing all the stories about what's happening with people, but that isn't as motivating to people as it is when they see that hurricane hit land. So what we learned is, when it comes to impact and news, you have to be there at the moment it's happening. When we saw Irma hit later on, it was sort of like there was very few donations, even though there was a very huge impact, because people had started to get hurricane fatigue.
See, but the many
Now we're in shooting fatigue, so that's even sadder. But you know, but looking at the data does show, both from a journalism perspective, like where people's hearts and minds are at.
So we're going to take questions in a few minutes. One thing I want to talk about is we've heard a lot about great successes that this group has had in their work. I want to talk about both big successes and big failures that we're seeing out there in the world. I'll start with a great failure, because it's always interesting to kind of think about how these things happen, right? If we take probably the highest profile inauthentic failure. We look at the Kendall Jenner for Pepsi, right? Just kind of shot heard around the world on how not to do things. And then you wonder about the thousands of decisions that happened to get us there. For all of us who have kind of seen this stuff happen, how does that occur? How do we get to the point where something so off-brand hits without someone saying, stop, this is wrong?
I mean, oh yeah, go ahead.
One-offs.
What?
One-offs. We call them one-offs. I think, Paul, you spoke to this earlier, is working with just one creator off the get-go can be dangerous for a brand, because, you know, things can happen with personalities. You know, we saw, you know, you've seen over the past couple of years several large creators being under scrutiny for content they've posted, and I think working with a variety of creators across different categories, and we work on the annual letter as well, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation do a good job at this, is working with beauty people, with tech, with science, and they all have their own spin to the message and the take, but they can all have the same message going forward. And so that's what we tell brands, is don't bank on one personality. Or we can do one-offs, sure, but there's a good chance that that creator might not love your brand, or the audience might not love it, and if you lock down a 10 video series, then you're in trouble as a brand.
Or sometimes they become kind of tone deaf. I think these larger, I've worked with, you know, Intel and Apple and Google, and you see at a certain level of an organization, and they have, you know, an immersion in society, and they have a certain status, and everyone gets at a table and kind of says yes, and you know, oh, great idea, and not because they're, you know, they don't care or they're not very intelligent people, they really are, but they get it's like they're in a white tower almost, you know, and there's like out of touch sometimes, you know, and then the agencies are so kind of running scared these days. Things are changing so much. It's been that's what I've seen in the last, especially 6 years, how difficult it has been for the agency leadership to stand up and say, you know, hey team, this isn't a good idea. You might fire me, but I'd rather be fired. Like that's where I really would. Like I'm the one, and that's why I'm not because I was fired, but I have my own agency because I feel so much more comfortable being on that outside and being able to say, like, you know, you can get rid of me. Like, I'm going to say that this isn't working because people are worried about their jobs and they don't want to contradict their boss or the big brand people or the Kendall Jenners of the world or whatever. And it's like you need somebody in the room who's willing to walk away to say, like, I know we're going to all make $1 bazillion here, but it's not the right way to do it. And I think some of it is about that side of things too. This is a completely different topic, but it hinges on this idea, a little bit of the greed. I mean, a little bit of the greed, not even just in money, but in the data and the numbers, and I want the big numbers and I want the big money. And sometimes it's like, you know, you're still going to do really well. Like, let's back off a little bit, do it correctly, the message is going to get through, and you're going to do better in the long run. You might not see that big hit as much, but you'll have, again, this long-term thinking, this longevity, you know, but people are really, I think people get scared in the moment to just say,
yeah,
this isn't a good idea.
I think ego is important, right? I think I know because the Creators League was in our office at my previous job the day before that launched. And we were supposed to have a meeting with 4 people from the Creators League. We had a meeting with 1 person because the other 3 people were working on deadline on that project. And we didn't get a ton of detail about it, but it was very clear that they had a date they had to hit. And that was the thing that was pushing them along, not the story,
right,
not the alignment,
yep,
not the objective. So ego, whether it's greed or getting something out on time because we are brand X, right? A lot of times it gets in the way,
yep,
of what you're actually trying to achieve.
Yep. Better to be late.
Yeah.
You could just get it. I think
especially with this, you have to do it right.
You have to do it right.
Yeah, I think
we
everyone
do
at
lose
Pepsi
track.
would agree on that. Let's take a few minutes and take any questions that our audience might have for any of our panelists. And if you're feeling particularly shy, we can ask more. Yes, sir.
Yeah. In terms of like a small company, somebody who has limited resources, how would, like, I have a book. I'm a writer, and I would like to get my book out there. I self-published myself, but I have an amazing book. Of course, I have an amazing cover. How do I, number one, resources, not no resources, but limited, how do I get my product out there so that people will see it, buy it?
I mean, if you're looking for an influencer, it's old school. To me, we have these technologies now that help us to amplify what we've always done as humans, like knock on a door, pick up a phone, tell a friend, tell a friend, tell a friend. I feel like it's almost more important now. I have, in my own business, I have a new brand, and the founder of that brand, she's very influential in her community, but she didn't want to get involved really with the brand. She wants us to market and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you need to pick up the phone. Like, you are connected, you need to talk to people. If people care about you, they're gonna care about what you care about. And if they don't, then call the next person. But it's more important even than just like a Facebook post. Everyone knows now how easy that is. And it just doesn't have any meaning. We're talking about hitting people on an emotional level. Your friend calls you. That's different from like an email that goes out to the 10,000 of their closest friends. You can tell when you've got an email that goes to 100,000 people. You're like, I don't feel any sort of pressure or interest really to do anything. It's not personal. So, I mean, I would just start, that's what I would do. I would start talking to people, grassroots, and just, you'll be led to something.
You're trying to drive more sales of your book or more consumption of your book. So you're telling a story. You've told a story. You've written that down on paper. Somebody out there is probably also telling your story, or has a shared interest in your story, or there's some natural alignment between the story you've told in your book and the story that they're telling in public. Find that person, right? And build a relationship and just say, look, we've got the same story. I give you my book for free. Read it. Tell me what you think, and let's partner, right? I think that is our approach, right? We build experiences. So it's like, look, we have soccer, hockey, music. Are you into those things? Cool, so are we. Let's talk and let's figure out what to build on top of that.
Sir, what's the title of your book?
Jessie and the Caterpillar Who Got Its Wings.
Love it.
Let's start by saying it every chance you can. Any other questions?
Hey, you can talk to me afterwards. I've actually done a New York Times bestseller and marketed it from A to Z. So
That's great.
I could talk about that for like 4 hours. So I'll spare everybody in the audience.
Yes, ma'am.
So something we haven't talked about that's really important with influencer marketing would be like FTC disclosure. And so I guess my question would be, especially you talked about, going to concerts and stuff. If an influencer is coming with a brand and you're also having them create content for Stagecoach, for instance, like how do you make sure that relationship is disclosed in the content?
Yeah, so I mean, stick to the guidelines, right? Like, they're there for a reason. The FTC is sending people letters, and they haven't really knocked anyone over the head for money, but you don't want to be the first one. I think, everyone's constantly trying to find ways to skirt it, and if the content is good, right, the disclosure won't matter, right? If the experience is good, the
Agreed.
disclosure is nothing. So that's the bottom line.
Now
Like,
they're worried about it.
we have operations and systems and processes. We have 3 set of eyeballs to make sure that there's a disclosure. We even have a compliance director. And one mistake brands make, if you send a free product to somebody, they need to disclose. That should be a paid disclosure. So the PR approach that a lot of brands do take, that needs to be disclosed, and that's something that doesn't happen actually very often.
You see it in a lot of reviews as well now, that they're really for the first time starting to see it marked. I received this product as, right, and the brand, it's the brand that has
And
to do that.
people are used to it because of that. I mean, that's even the younger audience, the Gen X, and they're saying very openly, like, we expect to be marketed to. We expect to get content that we'd like to watch anyway, and like it's sponsored by Hyundai or whatever.
Yep.
So it's more about exactly like you said. If it's great content, it doesn't matter.
Other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
Out of the 5 of you, do any of you work with either nonprofits or podcasts? Is that something that you guys touch on?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, awesome.
Or nonprofit podcasts?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. This has been a wonderfully engaging panel. I really appreciate it. And thank you for talking about that tension between data and the creative content. I mean, I feel like that has always been and will always continue to be there. I was curious,
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's fine. I think I can get it. You probably combine a couple there. The main thing, the context that I was talking about more in that was ensuring that if you're trying to communicate a humorous idea, if the humour is in the performance, the way we just simply go about testing that can be, the hurdle. And I'm working with a production company right now on being able to make it even better with different ways of doing that. So yeah, I mean, I could definitely talk to you more about that outside of here. But I think in general, the issue of risk, it's actually quite amazing too, that you pick the right influencer, it's the right brand fit and all the rest of it, and then there can be one very small executional thing that really sidetracks respondents. So we do a national survey, and you're just stunned. It's like, oh my God, this little thing that they've done or they've said or the behaviour clouds everything. And so I don't believe in pulling apart creative like a jigsaw puzzle and just sort of dissecting it. But again, in terms of data informing it, you can go, wow, the way they've said that, even though it wasn't interpreted, even though the intent wasn't to be polarizing in some way or offensive, you know what? It is offensive to this group or to whatever it is. So that way you can minimize risk. And it's the smallest thing. And and I think some of the obvious examples that you spoke about, it's like, how did that get through the net? And then there's these other examples where you wouldn't have thought it'd be polarizing at all, and then there's some particular expression or way it's done. So I think that's how we kind of do stuff and then test it.
So you had a question.
Yeah. So how do you go about establishing value or a payment rate for a specific influencer that you're trying to partner with? I feel like the influencer market is kind of like a Wild West, in that all these different influencers value themselves at different levels. Some are really high, some are really low. When you go into making a deal with an influencer, what do you look at to figure out how much they're worth paying?
I'll jump. I know you got a thought on this too.
I've done a few deals.
So the ideal is to tie it to your actual bottom line, whatever. So if you're trying to sell tickets, right, what is the value of, a standard share or an audience of 1,000 to your actual ticket sales against your target audience? You have to know a lot to get to that. So then you start backing into proxies, which is like, what is the average cost of trying to buy this engagement, right, in an ad product or something? That's what most people, I think, are using right now. Some of the influencers that are available on like open marketplaces and things like that have come with their own rates, and those rates should always be scrutinized because a lot of times they're arbitrary. So you should look at it towards your goal. But I think for me, at least personally, what I try to do is I try to figure out, what am I trying to get this person to do? What would it cost me to get somebody else to do that, right? Or what would it cost me to get that objective someplace else? And then try to figure out if it's worth working with that person. There's a lot more nuance to it, but speaking kind of high level. But
I would say, I would think in campaigns too, a little bit, because you'll have creators who charge a little bit more for their name than others. If you have good relationships, obviously that helps because they know you're going to come around and bring them deals on the regular basis. But I think in terms of campaigns, because you could have a creator, let's be honest, YouTube's algorithm changed last year, hurt a lot of creators as far as views go. And so, you had creators who were getting 1 million views who are now suddenly getting 200,000 views a video. And so you have to look from a guaranteed media perspective and have that lens. And I think even to celebrities to some extent too, is a lot of these celebrities have big names on their Instagram, but they don't have the data and the numbers to back them up. And so they're charging a lot of money for,
nothing.
100,000 likes when, it's quadruple the price that you'd normally pay. So putting on that lens of, okay, what is the value? What is that? And then working with experts have been doing it a long time, because there is, even though it is a wild, wild west, it's, it's been going on for a decade, so there are some industry standards across the board.
Certainly less wild than it once was.
Can I add one more thing on top of that? I know that, some of this data is like kind of hidden behind closed doors with some of these companies that, you've got 100,000 different creators and a tech platform and it's going to cost you $200,000.
They all talk like that.
I thought the impression was very good. Resources like the Eisenberg Social Index, which is free online, at least gives you a place to start. If you guys aren't aware of it, it's a great place for benchmarking the cost of most actions across social. Now, disclaimer, it's based on their point of view, and there's a lot of numbers in there that I could easily scrutinize based on my personal experience. I'm sure that everybody else on the panel could do the same thing, but it carries more legitimacy than a lot of other things, and so you'll have more credibility coming to the table saying, look, I'm looking at this index, what you're asking is way too much, let's at least come back down a year.
I'm sorry guys, we are a little after time. I apologize, Paul, and to the questions that were out there. I want to say big thanks to the audience for being a great and really integrated piece, and also a huge thank you. Please give it up for the panelists. You guys were great.
Good job. I wanted to hear what you had to say, Paul. You wanted to hear what I had to say? Yeah.